Hello there. Welcome to episode 5 of Product Musings. Today, I am going to be talking about analytics and how I think a lot of times they're used almost as a crutch and how you can make better decisions with them and really uncover those insights that maybe are kind of hidden and embedded. And one of my favorite stories about analytics comes from Groupon. I would think that most people listening to this probably remember Groupon. Or perhaps even used it in the past. Groupon was a site that was all the rage, probably about maybe 10 years ago or so, if I'm just not really thinking through it, but just kind of guesstimating here, maybe about 10 years or so. And Groupon had the ability to get some great discounts on some really fun activities or even specific products, oftentimes by gathering deals from suppliers and saying, hey, if we get this many people to sort of sign up and buy your product, what sort of discount would you offer? And because they had so many people using the service, they kind of knew about how many people might sign up for a specific solution or offering. And a really great idea that worked well for a very long time. Of course, they had billions of, the valuation was well over $1 billion and so much more. One of the stories that I love about it is it comes from their former CEO, who was the founder as well. And in one of the interviews, after he had sort of been let go from the company, he gave some insight into some of the thinking around their decision making. And the poignant story that I always remember, and it comes down to analytics, is one day he was in his office and he was given a choice and really an opportunity to say, hey, our analytics team has discovered that we get a ton of signups and a ton of growth when people receive their daily email. Oftentimes they check it, they say, hey, there's this great deal, and they'll actually sign up for it. And the team had the idea to run 2 emails a day. And they had actually, I believe, done a pilot on this as well, where they had seen solid numbers overall. And they said, listen, if we expand from 1 email a day to 2 emails a day, we could see dramatic growth. And the CEO talks about how he ultimately approved going with this process. But one of the things he always mentions is that internally, he was thinking to himself that, listen, the numbers make sense. You can't argue with the data. It's right there. But at the end of the day, who wants to receive 2 emails from Groupon every single day? And that was sort of this idea in his head that was in the back. And while he ultimately signed off on this because the data was there and it was measured, he continues to talk about how there was this thought in his mind of, what person wants 2 emails a day? Really, if you follow the path from that really initial point all the way through the rest of where Groupon went, the CEO talks about how that culture and that mindset and that focus really drove to a poor quality experience and a poor product experience as well. From that experiment, they saw ultimately email signups, like the value coming from someone signing up through an email, go down over time as people stopped A, paying attention to emails at all, and B, they stopped, therefore, actually signing up through the process, even sinking below when they were just receiving 1 email. And then from that as well, just that mindset and that approach led to a lot of more cyclical effects that ultimately brought Groupon down from its perch into where it is today, which is a shell of its former self. And the big thing that kind of comes to mind with Groupon and that story is analytics cannot become a crutch for common sense decision making and understanding people and understanding how people think and what people want and where they draw excitement from. People, in many ways, what you saw with something like Groupon is these people would sign up for Groupon. If they get a Groupon, they're going to get a great experience with friends. And so having that email come in, maybe there's an opportunity for getting that new experience, right? And as people started getting more and more emails, not only does it become more of just a spam-focused concept, but the quality of the deals you can promote go down as well. And people stop attributing high-level quality experiences at great value to these emails, and instead it just treats it as This is just another sort of marketing email coming out from a company that no longer offers the great value it once had. And as you start to see sort of the metrics and the growth and other pieces really surrounding that, the deals became lower quality and value as companies caught up with the overall sort of process by which Groupon works. They would deliver less value for the Groupon itself. And as you sort of see this whole mix of pieces, all these different pieces coming together, you see that you were delivering lower quality value more frequently, which is just going to annoy people. And ultimately, that's why, again, analytics there being used as a crutch instead of common sense failed. And I like to always sort of think about different areas when it comes to analytics and how you can be better and how you can have smarter insights pulled from analytics. Now, I've used a lot of different tools. I always like to think the best analytical tool is the one where you just talk to people and understand their anecdotes. And I love how frequently people will both accept anecdotes as this, sort of source of truth when it supports what they want. And then the moment it doesn't support what they want, they'll just say, well, that's just a single example. It's just a single anecdote. I think anecdotes are great because they are very raw, they're real, they're tangible, and they matter to a very specific customer who can oftentimes become an archetype of a larger customer. Perhaps not always, but many times. Now, yes, of course, you have to take that in the larger gamut. And if you're dealing with a piece of software that has 1 million users, well, you have to treat that differently than if you're dealing with the anecdote of one customer who is your only customer. It's, of course, a very different scenario. But I believe dealing with that type of analytic base is key and crucial in having those conversations. But outside of that, when it comes to other sort of tools, right, there's a lot of sort of software these days that can engage with customers, oftentimes right where they are, or perhaps they're doing sort of more monitoring analytics. A lot of my favorite tools in this area include, Heap, Mixpanel, Pendo, which has really bolstered up more of its analytical platform recently. You can always sort of get some stuff from Google Analytics, but that's kind of moved a little bit in different areas. It's not quite as like that user-focused analytical space. And there's some others as well, really dealing with user session recording and whatnot. When it comes to these types of questions, though, the way that I try to improve from my sort of analytics journey is sort of really a twofold process that go hand in hand. One is have a very specific question you want to answer. And two, when you're going down that journey, don't be tied to that question. So it's not good enough to just say, hey, let me dive into analytics today and see what's going on my site. If you do that, you are going to start at very peripheral, high-level vanity metrics, and you're oftentimes going to stay there. Perhaps you'll splice them up in different ways, but you'll stay in those vanity metric positions. Because if you don't have a specific concept you're trying to target, you're not going to get deep enough to really understand what is going on. And that's why I think having that specific, I want to target X and understand X, you're going to have to create a construct where you have a very deliberate filter set, you have a very deliberate framing of what it is you're looking for, and that metric cannot be a vanity metric because it is distinctively answering the question you are asking. And so if you're, one of the biggest vanity metrics people love to talk about is like page views, which of course is a vanity metric, doesn't tell you anything about the quality of your product. But if the question you really want to know is, for a lot of different reasons, there could be this question of how many people viewed our page. That's no longer a vanity metric. That's the metric that you want. But oftentimes that's not the deep enough question. And so if you're asking these deeper questions, you're going to really create a filter set and a context that you can build from. And of course, I'll give an anecdote to explain this in a moment. But I do then also want to say the second piece to that puzzle is not stopping at that answer, because oftentimes the question you're initially asking, sure, may answer the question itself. And that's all you need. But a lot of times the data you will find can be looked at in different ways and start to answer other questions that weren't even top of mind, but are really important and really valuable. One of the real ideas that comes to mind for this, again, sort of starting high level and then moving a little bit deeper. In my past experiences, one time I had a situation where I wanted to better understand how people were leveraging our system. And specifically, there were two different ways you could leverage a certain function within the application that I was working on. And one of the questions I wanted to know was, which one are people using more? Are they using the primary one, which is the more fluid and simple and way we wanted people to oftentimes promote? Or are we running, or do we oftentimes see people leveraging our secondary function, which is a little bit more hidden, not as effective of a use case scenario, but does exist for legacy reasons? In diving in initially on the data, what you found is, first off, if you were to just take the high level overview picture, that there was a direct correlation essentially between these two being used at a very even level. So as one would be used more on a specific day, the other would be used more as well. On the weekends, it'd go down certain times throughout the month. Perhaps you'd have spikes, but they'd go correlated together. And so, what that told us was, especially looking at the raw data as well and the numbers behind how much usage there was from a percent basis, they were about equal. Perhaps it was a little bit less for the one that was a little bit more of a manual focus, but in general, they were still correlated very well and both having high usage. Now, one of the ways we could have stopped at there was saying, listen, these both have high usage rates and we should continue to support them long term. And that would have been a fine answer. However, diving in deeper, again, I really love this concept of just pulling on threads and saying, first off, my mind, it didn't make much sense to me, knowing the context of the application I was working with, knowing the industry, knowing the people who use the solution. It didn't fully line up with perhaps my expectations, which I'm fine with being, learning something new. That's some of the most exciting times when you learn something new from your data, especially if it contradicts your understanding. It's really an exciting moment for me personally. It also, though, is something that I want to double check. And it's something that if I really understand my software and my application and my user journey and experience, I should sort of know where the pocket fits, or rather what fits in that pocket. And this didn't quite line up with that. And so you start pulling on threads, right? And diving deeper into, first off, how are we looking at this entire sort of cyclical usage? Both of them were being used roughly the same amount every day. Again, relative to their percentage of use. So, the manual was being used maybe about 30% or so. And that was the same every single day. But when you dived in a little bit deeper and started segregating these into different sections and went from monthly and weekly down to daily usage even, what you started to see is that there were more spikes among the manual usage versus the automated usage being a lot more continuous. And that sort of spoke to a lot of what I was looking at. Why do we see a manual usage being sort of spiked consistently? And one of the thoughts there was maybe there are power users, maybe a handful that just, they come in and they use it on a specific day. But when we actually looked at the number of users, sure, there were certainly less users in the manual section, but a significant number. Not like 3 or 4 people that are just coming in and really using this manual solution. It was a significant number. And from there, the thought is, okay, what's sort of separating these two groups of people? And do these people use them interchangeably, or do they, generally speaking, use one or the other themselves? In separating these into two groups, you find two things. One, people have a preference. They either use the automated solution or they use the more manual solution. There's no question about that. Very clear, very obvious. And that ultimately leads to who is this persona that is using the manual solution. And what we found is that persona was actually a secondary group of our traditional user base that don't really target. Oftentimes, they're not that number one person using our solution, but they would have to use it from time to time. And as those people would come in, they perhaps didn't have the standard user journey. They perhaps didn't have the onboarding process. They were instead told, this is the specific page you get information from. And that page is also where we had our manual solution as well. And so they would just naturally gravitate to that area and always use that more laborious solution long term. And in building around this method, what we sort of discovered was not only are these people our secondary users, but they're people that oftentimes, despite being secondary, can be a very powerful voice in the conversation of should we continue to use this product or not. And so when you have maybe about 30% of your users using a solution that doesn't get a lot of focus, is a very manual process, doesn't build on all the automation work you've done, and even though they're a secondary user, not nearly as numerous as others, they're still very important voices in the procurement process and the software utilization process. In building out of that thread, continuing to pull those threads, really discovered, okay, we need to really focus in on this type of secondary user and how do we guide them to leveraging the better, more automated process long term. Now, if we had just stopped at that high level question, which was a valuable question and gave us a good answer of these are being used over the course of a month about equally in terms of alignment, with again, maybe 30% or so using the manual process, whatnot, you would have gotten the answer that yes, they're both used tools. However, there's a preference to, the automated ones. But building from that, if you had said, hey, we really want to drive down that 30% number, well, you may be approaching that from targeting the wrong user persona. And you may be targeting them on the wrong days when, you have specific power users coming in on specific days, having these spikes. If you don't understand that type of user being separate from your larger user group, you're going to have the wrong approach as a whole. And so it's very critical, at least from that experience and others that I can point to as well, where you start to understand getting to a good answer is a great starting point. But pulling threads and saying, how can we segment this differently? That's an interesting data point. That goes against what I initially thought would be the way. That doesn't line up with my understanding of the industry. How can you pull all these little different threads and weave a better question that starts to answer things that either A, weren't part of your initial question at all, or B, just gives so much more context to it that you can make a better decision as a whole. And I think pulling those threads are key. And another sort of great one as well is a situation, I'll keep this anecdote a little bit shorter, but a different scenario where I was working on a specific project and I was curious on how our analytics looked in terms of browser usage, right? That's, again, something that may be considered almost, it's not quite a vanity metric because it's important to understand, that's not something you can really change or drive frequently. You can have some companies like YouTube that really try to actually change user behavior in terms of which browser they use. But certainly, our product solution and where it was being used internally and whatnot, as well as others, it's not going to be able to make that change. And I dived into, what browsers our users were leveraging. And a major surprise, like 95%, of course, are using Chrome. It wasn't quite that. It was more about 90%. But if you actually looked at the amount of Chromium usage, because it was across Chrome and I know Edge as well, the new Edge that was Chromium based and some others, it was about 95% with maybe some dragging percentage around Firefox at 2% or so, and then Safari around 3 or 4%. Which in seeing that, Chrome and Firefox and Edge all work really well with a lot of things that go on with WebKit, or not WebKit, but rather just standards in creating these HTML standards. There is an outlier, and that's always Safari, which is throwing fits. Not to mention, of course, Internet Explorer, but that's a little bit even more legacy and outdated, not to focus on. Safari, though, is causing issues. And I use Safari all the time. I love Safari for its privacy features, among other things. It just integrates really well, but I will admit it is an inferior browser in different ways. However, I did use Safari. And so a lot of times I would be working on this specific application. I'd come across little issues, and I'd be like, hey, we should fix this. Well, it's only 2 to 3%, right? If you're looking at your data, maybe you shouldn't be focusing on that because that's what, we're looking at these analytics. We have more key things to focus on than this 2 to 3% who are still getting a pretty great experience overall. There's just some key areas where they're not. Again, you have to pull on the threads. In pulling on those threads, some of the things I learned, right? One, when segmenting by titles and segmenting by industry and understanding who these users were, what you learn is a lot of times, of course, if you're using Safari, it means you're on a MacBook. MacBook being or maybe using an iPhone, but that was a mobile Safari. So specifically on a MacBook is generally where you'd see it. And MacBooks are oftentimes, if you look at industry as a whole and how enterprises are segmented, reserved for either executives who want them or someone higher up the chain. And these are the type of people who will actually be A, making purchases, procurement, signing contracts, and B, leveraging your solution rarely. So they only get a few opportunities to actually see your product. And so if you're delivering a sub-quality experience for the person who is going to be signing that contract And they're only going to use your software a few times, probably in between each contract signing piece. And they get a bad experience. That's not going to look good as a whole. And when we actually looked at the analytics in that framework, what we saw, if we just sort of segmented it to these specific larger, or rather subgroups of executives and people who are going to be dealing with contracts, et cetera, you saw that 2 to 4% spike all the way up to over 25%. It didn't cross into like the 50 or whatever, but it was over 25%. And that's really when you think about it, because mentally your model is you have 1 in 4 people who are critical on contracts, possibly having a sub-quality experience. Okay, how should we approach it now? That doesn't mean every single time something goes wrong with a Safari browser, you go in and fix it. Of course not. What it does mean is understanding what is the user experience on something like Safari, given that that person is likely going to be in the executive path or otherwise, and how can you ensure that at least that experience is always going to be polished up? Fires are always going to be burning on software. There's always going to be something else you've got to fix. You can't fix every bug all the time, especially for singular browsers used by, in general, 2% of your population. But when you think about the user journey for an executive, a person that's going to be important for getting that next sale in a B2B environment, it's critical you think about that pathway. And if you're making changes in that pathway, that it aligns with that user who may be going along that pathway, such as an executive on a MacBook using Safari. And so ultimately leverage that to have some really great cases where we could build solid performance in that specific browser space along those different user journeys. Again, something that would not happen if you're not pulling on those threads and saying, that's an interesting number, makes sense, but what if we dive a little bit deeper? Because you could have sort of stopped at browsers and said, hey, that's more of a vanity, but just making sure, sort of a checkbox, and that would have been, you would have gotten somewhat of an answer. But pulling a little bit deeper, you get a better understanding of what that data actually means. And the actual human behind that 2% is a very different scenario, a very different story, a very different experience than the 2% number just sitting in a pie chart. And when you get to what that human experience is there, when you get to that human experience of that secondary user who is doing manual work, when you get to that human experience of opening up your second email of the day from Groupon, you recognize, wait a second, the analytics make sense. But man, this is just a bad user experience. How can I improve it? And so focus on building products that users love, not just by leveraging analytics as a crutch, but by building analytics into your platform of discovery. That's where they work best. As the product manager, as a person thinking from a product mindset, though, you have to dig deeper. You have to build on your own product intuition. What makes sense in this industry? What makes sense from a user journey on this product? Those are questions that you should be building around, and context you should be building within to answer these types of questions. It's not just what the number says, but it's how you apply that number to the context it is in and pulling these threads to best understand what it's really trying to tell you. So don't go the Groupon route. I know the former CEO of Groupon certainly feels that way. Love his honesty and his deeper thoughts. I would highly recommend looking more into that story and what you can learn from that. Some great business understandings as well. But again, the summation that I just want to kind of align to here is when it comes to analytics, start with a great question, answer that question, and then pull threads and say, that's interesting. What does this mean? To get an even better answer overall. And that's what I'm here to opine on today. I hope you've enjoyed this little episode here. I hate doing this, but they say it's great for the analytics, as it were, right? So if you do enjoy this episode, or if you found value and actually listened all the way through to the end here, please go ahead and follow the podcast or like it, depending on which platform you're on. If you're on Apple, if you're on Spotify, or otherwise YouTube, etc. It really will help sort of, again, drive just some of those other pieces along the way as we look forward to trying to build up a better sort of product space and product musing set here. But really appreciate you taking the time to listen in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Have a good one. Take care.